Okay, first things first, holy fuck, Vegeta finally got a win. Oh my god, is it a great time to be a Vegeta fan right now. But I should be screaming from the rooftops for the rest of this video, blown away in the same way I was with the first Tamagami fight. This was directed and storyboarded by the very same person, Kazuya Kurosawa. The staff list was virtually identical, with almost the same animators and then some, but the results were fine, okay, decent, even very good at times. But this was Daima's second major fight, the debut of Vegeta's Super Saiyan 3 form in a mainline story, the climax of the Tamagami Dragon Ball hunt after all of this build-up. With that taken into consideration and the staff list virtually matching episode 8, on paper this looked like the best episode yet, and that was why I built it up just so much last week. But having seen the results, I think it fell a little bit flat, and I know I'm not alone in feeling this way. Now bear with me. Unfortunately, I have a slight inkling of why this is the case, and it makes me a little bit nervous going forwards. We're all well aware of just how strong Daima's production schedule is. I mean, this episode was storyboarded between January and April of 2023. The show was approaching the finish line before it even hit the air, but something has become very apparent over these last few months. This production team is small, and the allocation of resources is quite confusing. Week after week, the same action animators have continued to appear again and again. Shuichiro Minabe, Takumi Yamamoto, and Yuichi Kurosawa have been on 6 of the 12 episodes so far. Yohei Sasaki, Ken Otsuka, and Isamu Takara have been on 5. Then there's people like Sander, who may have only appeared in a few episodes, but have animated 40 to 50 cuts per appearance. These action stars of the series are stretched so thin that the benefits of a good schedule are visibly lessened. You can't be ambitious if the deadline of your next appearance is already approaching. But then I look at the staff allocation and I start to feel confused even more. Yuya Takahashi, the fan favorite, has been all over Daima, but only in a supervisory role. He hasn't provided any key animation of his own since episode 2. He's one of 2 chief ADs on this episode, and yet, in spite of the split responsibilities here, there's still no key animation from him. Now that's not the end of the world, but in cases like this, you then have to start relying on guest stars to elevate episodes. We saw that with Kozue, Takeshi Morita, Osamu Sakata, heck, even Hiromi Ishigami last week, and that starts to make me question staff allocation. Why are guests being used in low-key episodes rather than allocated towards bigger episodes to give the series regulars breathing room? It's a really peculiar problem to have, and hopefully not one to be of a major concern going forwards, but with this episode failing to reach the heights of its previous climax despite their shared production environment, I wanted to voice these concerns so that we can check back in towards the end of this series and see whether this was just a one-off whiff. But let's put that aside and jump into some positivity, because the base animation director for this episode is Yuichi Hamano, someone who was last seen on episode 4, though his presence there wasn't really felt much. Now that's a stark contrast to this episode where he is everywhere. I talked a little bit back then about how he's most well known for his stylish effects work with shapes that used to get him mistaken for Shida all the time, funnily enough. He goes so hard with correcting effects in this episode that in virtually every major scene, you will find his distinctive shapes. But while his AD work is actually pretty cool, it's his own piece of animation that I really enjoyed the most here. This is far and away my favorite bit of action from the Vegeta portion of the fight. Not only are those effect shapes great as always, but it's a very fast-paced and snappy bit of animation, something I felt many other scenes in Vegeta's portion were lacking. This feels super pacey with great posing, snappy timing, and dynamic camera work that brings a level of intensity to this fight that it's sorely crying out for. I think it stands in stark contrast to how much of this fight goes following this prior to the transformation. It suddenly slows right down, loses a lot of dynamism, and really feels like it's stepped out of a much weaker production, one where talents aren't quite sure how to transition fluidly from pose to pose. It's interesting because the start of this episode is really solid. You have French animator Nightberry doing a cute little rotatey bit as the Kraken comes out the water with a charming little smear. Then there's what looks like Yuichi Kurosawa animating Vegeta dodging the tentacles. It has that kind of robotic timing Kurosawa is known for, but it feels big enough scale and it's well directed enough to work well. I feel that especially when Vegeta's stuck inside the mouth of the Kraken and he's just lit up by the sparks of his transformation. That's such a great bit of direction, and I've got to hand it to the photography team for pulling that off just so well. The thing is, the episode then jumps into the Do fight, and despite the emphasis of the episode clearly being on Vegeta, it's Do who's afforded the episode's biggest talent, and thus the best animated scene of the episode. A whole minute from Yohei Sasaki just popping off so hard. I mean, you've heard me talk about his strengths before, but God is he special. Look at all this tremendous posing and remarkable timing. There's so much speed and weight behind every bit of motion, and it's just flawless through and through. It's intense when it needs to be, it's fun where it matters, it's just far and away the best scene of this episode, and I'm left once again scratching my head as to why the emphasis was put here, and that's because it just keeps going, even into places where I don't even know who the animator is, I just know it's really fucking good. You get Dragon Ball Z veteran Hitoshi Inaba animating Do running away in this crazy 3-tone debris with the explosion, then there's fellow vet Tadayoshi Yamamuro animating a huge chunk of this battle that's also surprisingly pacey and filled with really nice effects work. I mean, he literally finishes his sequence animating Do breakdancing and it looks fantastic. I'm walking away from an episode where Super Saiyan 3 Vegeta debuts, more blown away by Majin Do's animation because his section just had all of the production emphasis. Isn't that crazy? I think part of the issue is that the translation from board to animation layout wasn't always very successful in Vegeta's portion. Sometimes there were instances where big sweeping layouts in the storyboard became neutered from poor layouts and mediocre background work, especially during the segments underwater. The board is pretty explicit in its focus on diffused light seeping in from above, providing intense contrast on the characters under the water, and it uses the scale of the ocean to make the area feel huge. It's a technique director Kurosawa used really well in episode 8, where the arena was massive and the light from Goku's Kamehameha bathed the scene in this really contrasty light. It just doesn't exist in this episode despite that being the original intent in the board, and so many of these quieter moments that should look stunning and dramatic are just kind of flat. Small scale? It's a shame. At the very least, I think the transformation itself delivered big. Yuya Takahashi's corrections are so strong here and fit perfectly with what is such a serious and dramatically lit moment. I have to shout out the compositing team here for such a great job with all of that lighting. Even the CG water here works quite well, which is certainly a contrast to how it looks in other parts of the episode. Most importantly, the scale is massive. I really adore the design work, and it's nice to see Toriyama remaining steadfast in his approach to giving Super Saiyan 3 different hair depending on who the character is. Goku's is super long and wavy, Gotenks is extremely wide and spiky like a hedgehog and his eyes have no pupils, and now Vegeta gets his own look, almost like a blossoming flower or Gohan Beast with a mullet. As the action begins and we move into this big old climax, it's Ken Otsuka who takes the reins. While I do think the 3-frame loop at the start is kinda not good, the rest of the scene is great stuff and feels like Kurosawa's board brought to life with all the care that it deserves. The big sweeping camera work over the sea is exactly the type of approach he loves, and it adds some much needed oomph and scale to this climax. That ending with the killer layout as Vegeta throws his whole self into the punch is fantastic. Just look at the way Otsuka animates the Tamagami blasting through a whole ass hand-drawn planet. That shit is fucking awesome, and frankly the ending to this fight just sums up the great attitude Kurosawa gave Vegeta in this board. Just an onslaught of pure cockiness and calm destruction. Absolutely perfect for a lovable little gremlin. With the battle over, all that's left is for Takahashi and the Katsuru to polish up the artwork, and interestingly, the flip note illustrations during the Brain Challenge come from Ayumi Nagaki, someone who designed all of the props for Bocchi the Rock. I'm not entirely sure why they popped up on Daima to draw this, but fine, cool. I just feel so confused by this episode though. Like, I had a good time, it had some nice moments of animation, but it just didn't really land for me in a way that I think an episode like this should. As I kicked off the video saying, this had all the makings of Daima's best episode when you looked at what's there on paper, both in terms of the staff and the storyboard. But unfortunately, I think it just succumbed to a lack of animation talent to make up for the series regulars who simply don't have enough time to meet the ambitions that an episode like this required. I'm sure for many of you, just seeing Vegeta finally get a win in a cool form is enough, and that's fine. But for me, that's not new information. I'm looking at how this succeeded from a production standpoint, and the answer is, once again, it was fine. Okay, decent, again, even good at times, but to me, that's not quite what I want for a mid-series climax on a show with this much lead-in time. As we move into the next episode, we do finally get our first Aya Kamaki episode, the co-series director, who's been notably absent since episode 1, and that already looks to be a huge step up in direction alone. This last portion has a lot to deliver, and I hope it finally manages to pull some big emotions out of me, because boy do I want to feel excited or cry or both at the same time. I know not everyone was as lukewarm on this episode as me, so feel free to yell at me in the comments if you felt differently. In a nice way, of course, it's only a cartoon, but otherwise, be sure to like the video, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you next time.